Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Fei. I'm the lead field engineer for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So, as a field engineer, we support the business development team. That means whatever technical support that they may require will come in. So sometimes when we visit studios or companies, especially non-game companies, because they are not familiar with Unity, and when we tell them that, hey, Unity can do this, Unity can do that, they are not convinced, right? So sometimes we may be required to do like a proof of concept to show that, hey, this works. And sometimes these kind of proof of concepts involves like realistic light rendering, for example, like an architectural visualization project. So I did one of these recently. So I needed architectural walkthrough that has very realistic lighting. And to achieve realistic lighting, usually you have to tweak a lot of lighting parameters. And this can be frustrating or confusing, especially when the outcome doesn't match what you're expecting. So this talk aims to clarify some of this confusion and show you a comparison between the different quality and baking time by tweaking different parameters. So lighting is a very broad topic, too broad to cover in this very short amount of time. So I'm going to narrow down my focus to direct lighting and indirect lighting. But that is to say, like I want to cover the interior and the exterior. So more specifically, for direct lighting, I want to cover real-time direct light and how the different render pipeline processes the real-time light. And for indirect lighting, I want to cover real-time GI and baked GI. So to talk about lighting, we have to talk about the render pipeline. That's because different render pipelines handles lighting differently. So Unity comes with the built-in render pipeline, and with SRP, we have the lightweight render pipeline template, and we have the high-definition render pipeline template, and you can write your own custom render pipeline. But I'll be focusing on these three pipelines, the built-in one, lightweight render pipeline, HD render pipeline. So for the built-in render pipeline, before Unity 2018, this is the only option. And it is a very mature, very flexible render pipeline that can handle many different needs, can handle different platforms, but it is getting a little bit old, and it is a black box. You have no idea what goes on in there, and there is limited capability for you to customize it. So with the built-in render pipeline, it comes with 4 render paths. The multi-pass forward, multi-pass deferred, and 2 legacy render paths, the deferred and vertex lit. So to help you choose which render path suits your project best, you can refer to this link here in the manual to do a comparison between the different render paths. What are they good at? What are they not good at? But in a nutshell, forward render path can be very fast, but the number of real-time lights will affect your performance. Deferred is good at handling many real-time lights, but requires certain level of hardware support. Vertex lit is the fastest, but you only get vertex lighting. Legacy deferred doesn't support standard shader and reflection probe. So these are, in a nutshell, the differences and limitations. So for forward rendering, you get some number of per pixel light, and you can configure this in the options. You can have a maximum of 8 per pixel light. You can have maximum of up to 4 per vertex light, and the rest of the lights in your scene will be handled as spherical harmonic lights. And if you mark a light as not important, it will always be per vertex or spherical harmonic lights. If you marked it as important, then it will always be per pixel. The brightest directional light in your scene is always per pixel. So remember in the earlier slide when I show you, you can configure the number of per pixel light in your quality settings. So what happens if you set it to 0? So you don't want any per pixel light. What happens if you set it to 0? But in your scene, you still have a directional light, right? And that's the brightest one. So that is still considered as a per pixel light. So in forward rendering, every object is rendered in different multiple passes. So the base pass will render the directional light and all per vertex and spherical harmonic lights. And of course, the light map, ambient, and emissive lights from the shader. And additional lights affecting that object will require additional passes. So for example, if you have an object that's shined on by 4 lights, so the first light, the directional light, will be processed in the base pass, and additional 3 lights, that's additional 3 passes. So in total, you get 4 passes. And that is why for forward rendering path, it can get very expensive if you have a lot of real-time lights. But for deferred rendering, all lights is evaluated as per pixel, and you can have unlimited number of per pixel lights. And the performance cost of a light is only affected by the number of pixels that is affected by the light. So it's not per object, but the pixels on the screen that is eventually affected by the light. But there are some limitations, though. There's no real support for anti-aliasing and transparent objects. And you can't have you can't toggle on and off this option for receive shadows on specific objects. Unlike the forward render path, you can't say, oh, for this object, I don't want it to receive shadows. For this one, I want it to receive shadows. In deferred render path, every object will receive shadows. And there's no support for deferred render path if you're using an orthographic camera. So if you're doing like a 2.5D kind of game using the orthographic camera, you can't use deferred. So deferred rendering uses up to 4 render targets. And if you're using the shadow mask, it will require the 5th render target. So if the hardware doesn't support the 5th render target, it will fall back to the forward rendering path. And this is important because you may be thinking that your game is optimized for deferred, but if the hardware doesn't support the 5th render target, you'll fall back to forward, and the game may run very poorly because of a lot of lights, right? So that's the built-in render pipeline and the different render paths. For lightweight render pipeline, it is a single pass forward. So unlike the built-in one, which is a multi-pass, this is a single pass. What this means is, if an object is affected by multiple lights, all these lights are handled in one single pass instead of in multiple passes. So it's a lot more performant. But you can have up to 8 lights, so you can't have more than that. There are some limitations. Point lights does not cast shadow. There's no real-time GI support, and you can't use subtractive and shadow mask light modes. The HD render pipeline. So HD render pipeline uses the configurable tile cluster deferred forward rendering, and it's a lot more efficient in accumulating lights because now you don't need to blend overlapping lights one by one like what you have in the deferred render paths. So you can have up to 24 lights per pixel, and it's physically based, so the result is a lot more accurate. The GI is also inverse square fall off, so it's a lot more accurate as well. So what about indirect lights? So a scene would not look very convincing without some form of indirect light. And achieving real-time indirect lighting is very expensive. So usually it involves some form of baking or real-time performance sake. And Unity offers 2 solutions, the real-time GI and baked GI. But when I say real-time GI, I don't really mean real-time. It's pre-computed real-time. What this means is we'll calculate or pre-calculate all the possible light angles that comes in and goes out when it hits the surface, all possible angles. So when you have already calculated all the possible paths that a light can come in and go out, then you can do like indirect lighting that changes during runtime. But this means it is pre-computed. It's not actually real time. So for new users, when you start a project, what they don't realize is usually real-time GI is enabled by default. And then you may have heard, oh yeah, I heard that for performance sake, I should bake my stuff. So I should enable bake GI, right? And so what new users normally do is you then enable bake GI with real-time GI already enabled. So then you have two systems enabled at the same time, real-time and bake GI. So actually, you don't need both systems. You have to, you can select one or the other. Because if you have both enabled at the same time, you're increasing complexity. You're increasing performance costs. And unless you know what you're doing, you should choose one over the other. So how would you decide, should I go with real-time GI or big GI? So for real-time GI, this is handled by Enlighten. And the question you should ask is, do I require, or my game, does it require changing indirect lights? Or do my lights change? If it does, then maybe real-time GI is the solution for you. And if you do go with real-time GI, these are the settings that you can mess with in the Lightmap settings. So you have indirect resolution, directional mode, indirect intensity, albedo boost, and you have the Lightmap parameters. So what does all these different parameters mean? So the first one, indirect resolution. So this basically says the number of texels per unit to use for indirect lighting calculation. And for indoor scenes, the general recommendation is to use 2 to 3 texels. For outdoor scenes, you can use much lower, 0.5 to 1 texels. For terrains, you can even go even more lower, like 0.1 to 0.5 texels. So here's an example or a comparison that I did. So I have a very simple scene, a very small room. I've set it to the default high resolution Lightmap parameter. And then I set it to a default 2 texels per unit for indirect resolution. And the baking time took 1 minute. So I increased it to 3 texels per unit. And this is the result. It's very dark, isn't it? Can we dim the lights? So it's a little bit dark here. I hope you can see. So with 3 texels per unit, it took 5 minutes. Baking time increases to 5 minutes. But you can see this is 2 texels per unit. This is 3 texels per unit. And if you notice over here, you get more detail in the shadows. Right? So this is 2 texels, this is 3 texels. And in general, you get more detail. Right? And so remember the recommendation, 2 to 3 texels per unit for indoor scenes. You shouldn't go more than 3. You could go to 4, but you should never need to go more than 4. But for the sake of it, I went to 10. And this is the result. So look at the nice detail over here, like on the blanket, right? Versus what I had with 3 texels per unit. This is 3 texels. This is 10, right? So look at all the nice detail. But baking time is more than 1 hour. I don't exactly know how long it took. I left it to bake, went to bed, woke up the next morning, and it was done. But I'm pretty sure it's more than 1 hour. So why shouldn't you use 10 texels per unit then? Because you get all the details, right? But why shouldn't you use it? Because you are adding CPU and memory costs at runtime. The higher the texels per unit, the more time the CPU requires to calculate all the different light paths at runtime, as well as storing the information at runtime. So it uses up more memory. And also, with the higher texels per unit, you have a very high chance of getting black patches. So you don't see in this screenshot here, but the rest of the room shows a lot of black patches. So again, 3 texels, 10 texels, but you should never have to go over 4 texels per unit for indoor scenes. So next one, indirect intensity. So this decides the brightness of your indirect light. So if you compare the left and right image, you will see this spot here that's affected by a direct light because the light is directly shining on it. And if you compare both images, the brightness there doesn't change. What changes is the indirect lights, the overall brightness of the scene from bounce lights or from indirect lights. So intensity of 1 looks like that, intensity of 5 is brighter. For albedo boost, this is actually artificially introducing more light rays to your scene. So when a light bounces off a surface, we are artificially adding more light rays that bounces off. So for example, when a light, maybe like 5 light rays enters a surface and bounce off, you would expect 5 light rays or less exits. But here we are artificially increasing it, so maybe 5 enters and 10 or 20 exit, which is not physically correct. But the result is you get more light rays, more light bounces in your scene, and you get an overall brighter scene. So then what's the difference between albedo boost and indirect intensity? So if you see here on the left, that's albedo boost of 10. On the right, that's an indirect intensity of 5. So for albedo boost, actually you see you are losing some of the details. If you compare with indirect intensity, you still get the shadows and the bounce lights, but over here it's more washed out because you're just artificially increasing the brightness. It's not physically correct. So here's a larger image for comparison. This is 10, albedo boost 10. This is indirect intensity of 5. But sometimes you may require to do this, especially if it's a stylized game. Cool. So the last one is Lightmap parameters. So you can think of this as a config file, a configuration file that you apply to the entire scene. So this configuration file contains even more parameters. So these are some of these parameters: resolution, cluster resolution, irradiance budget, irradiance quality, and so on. So let's go over some of the more important ones. Resolution. So this is basically just a multiplier of your indirect resolution. So let's say you set your indirect resolution to 2, right? 2 texels per unit. And in your Lightmap parameters, if you set this resolution to 0.5, then you're doing 0.5 multiplied by 2, you get 1. So your overall or your final texels per unit is actually 1. So this is a multiplier. Cluster resolution. So for real-time GI, Enlighten will voxelize the scene, and cluster resolution basically determines the size or resolution of the voxels, how big the voxels are, basically. So sometimes you may consider increasing the resolution for the cluster resolution, especially if you notice you're not catching some of the bounce lights. So for example, you have a red color wall and there's a white color floor. If light bounces off the red color wall to hit the floor, you may expect some red tint on the white color floor, right? But if the voxel size is not big enough to catch that, then you will not see that bounce red color tint on the floor. So for this kind of situation, you may consider maybe increasing your cluster resolution to capture that. Irradiance budget and irradiance quality. So here's a description, but to put it in layman terms, irradiance budget determines the precision or accuracy of the result. So the lower this value is, the blurrier the lighting result. The higher the value is, the more accurate the GI, but also it will increase your memory usage, and there will be additional CPU overhead at runtime. For irradiance quality, this determines the number of rays that a texel is able to shoot out in the scene in order to find visibility of neighboring clusters. So like, for example, if you have a very narrow pole, right, and then the scene is already voxelized. A cluster may miss this pole if there's not enough light rays that they are shooting out. So then you don't get, for example, the color bleeding from that pole to that resulting cluster. So if you increase the quality, the irradiance quality, you get more light rays that will shoot out, and there's a higher chance for it to hit that light pole or the narrow pole, right? Modeling tolerance. So very often, and this is unavoidable, you will have models or meshes that are in contact with another mesh. For example, like here, there's a basket that is placed on top of a floor. So when two surfaces are very close together, the gap is very small. So light rays cannot enter or cannot exit, and that area is usually very dark. But with real-time lights, because our cluster resolution is relatively big, so these dark patches might then extend out, and you will see some of these black patches. So to avoid these kind of black patches, you can increase the modeling tolerance to ignore that small gap. So that was real-time GI. For baked GI, there are several solutions. You can use the Enlighten for baked GI as well. You can use the progressive Lightmapper for baked GI. And there's the new GPU progressive Lightmapper, which is in preview right now. So Enlighten is not very easy to use. I prefer to use the progressive Lightmapper because you get a more instant feedback. As soon as you start baking, you see the scene started changing, and you can still continue to work. You don't have to wait for the entire bake to finish before you see a result. So that's my preferred Lightmapper, and I will cover this instead of the Enlighten in this talk. So big GI with the progressive Lightmapper. These are the parameters that you get: direct samples, indirect samples, bouncers, filtering, and so on. So again, let's compare some of these more important parameters and see what they do. Direct samples and indirect samples. So this basically determines the number of samples used in calculating your direct and indirect samples. So higher samples means you have less noise, but increases your bake time. So again, let's take a look at some examples. So with the same scene that I have, set everything to default. So 2 bouncers, 20 texels per unit with auto filtering, and I've set the indirect samples of 512. This took 1 minute to bake, and this is the result. And I increased that indirect samples to 2,048 indirect samples, and this is the result. Baking time increases to 1.5 minutes. But if you compare these two, you can see for 512 indirect samples, there's a lot more noise on, if you notice like the top right corner there, where there is darker, you can see there's a lot more noise. You can also see like this area here, Compare that with 2,000 indirect samples. So indirect samples, the higher indirect samples you have, the less noise you get. And I increase this further to 5,000 indirect samples, and this is the result. It's not obvious here, but it's a lot cleaner. But the baking time also increases. It shot up to 4 minutes. So from 512 increases to, from 1 minute increases to 1.5 minutes, and then from 2,000 indirect samples to 5,000 increases to 4 minutes. Cool. Next one, filtering. So basically, with all this noise in your baked map, filtering will try to remove some of this noise by blurring. So there are 2 options that you can use for the filtering: Gaussian blur and the A-torus blur, A-torus filtering. And you can compare. So with Gaussian blur, actually, it blurs the entire thing, but A-torus is better at preserving detail. So if you notice this area here, so the contact point between the shadow and the mesh is not as bad. It's not as good as what you have on the A-torus. So bounces. So this determines the number of indirect bounces before the light dies off. So when a light hits a surface, it will bounce off, and it will bounce off again when it hits another surface. So this basically says how many bounces the light can have before it dies off. So obviously, the more bounces it have, then the brighter your indirect light is. And there's also a higher chance for it to capture some of the light bleeding. So like, for example, the red wall and the white floor example, right? So with 2 bounces, baking time is 1.5 minutes. With 4 bounces, that increases to 3 minutes. And overall scene is also brighter. There's no surprise there. So next one is Lightmap resolution and Lightmap size. So these two can be very confusing because resolution and size, they sort of mean the same thing. So how do you really wrap your head around this? So let's take this room, for example. So the size of this room, let's say it's 10 meter by 10 meter, right? This can be, you can think of this as the Lightmap size. The Lightmap resolution will determine our size. So let's say every one of us here is a UV chart, right? If you increase the Lightmap resolution, every one of us will become bigger. At some point, we'll become giant, right? So right now, this room can fit every one of us here, but if you keep increasing the Lightmap resolution, at some point, we'll be so big that not every one of us can be fitted in this room. Some of us will be spilled out of the room. And those that got spilled out of the room, they'll be placed in another room. So this other room is another light map. So if you increase the resolution, at some point, some UV charts will have to be placed in another light map. And this also means that you have additional light maps. So this means that you have additional draw calls. But what happens if we increase to a point where a single UV chart is too big to fit into that light map? Imagine like if one of us is a giant now that we can't even fit in this one room. Part of us will spill out of the room. What happens then? So Unity will cap the UV charts to the maximum, to the size of the light map. So this also means if you just keep on increasing the resolution, at some point you're not getting more detail because it's already capped to the size of the light map. So then you have to increase the size of the light map itself. So instead of a 1K map, you now need a 2K map to accommodate for all these new, all these higher density, all these details. So in general, higher light map resolution, you have better quality, but will result in multiple light map textures and longer bake time as well. So here's a comparison. 2,000 indirect samples, 4 bounces with auto filtering, 20 texels per unit. This took 3 minutes. At 40 texels per unit, this took 14 minutes. But again, you can compare. You get more details. You can see like the shadow casted by the chair. Get more detail. And if I increase this to 90 texels per unit, this is the result. It took 1 hour. But you get, again, more detail. So I tried to increase this even further to, but I think it gave up. I tried to increase this more than 90 texels, but my machine gave up. I left it to bake, wake up the next morning, and it was still baking, so had to kill it. And this is where the GPU progressive Lightmapper can be very useful, because it is very fast. It's 10 to 20 times faster than the CPU progressive Lightmapper. But there are some limitations currently. We'll be adding and removing some of these limitations. So currently, there's no double-sided GI, and all geometries will always cast and receive shadows. There's no big LODs, and you can't use the A-torus filtering, only Gaussian blur. And there's no submesh support. So if your mesh has submeshes, you'll only read the first submesh material for Lightmap baking. And there are also some hardware requirements. So your GPU will need to support OpenCL 1.2, CPU will need to support SSE 4.1, and you need the latest graphics drivers. You can find out more from the forum thread here. There are more instructions and tips on how to use the GPU progressive Lightmapper. One thing to note though is, if your machine has multiple GPUs, like mine, I have a dedicated GTX 1060 and an integrated GPU. When I start Unity, Unity uses my dedicated GPU, the GTX 1060. So then if I use the GPU progressive Lightmapper, it will try to use the GPU that is not used by Unity editor. That means the integrated GPU. So if you find that your baking time is not as fast as what you expect, that may be the issue. It's using the integrated GPU, which is not as fast as your dedicated one. For now, the way to choose which GPU to use, you would have to use a command prompt parameter. But in the future, we'll convert this to like a drop-down that you can select. And also, during the baking time, if it ran out of memory, you then fall back to the CPU progressive Lightmapper. Right, so going back to that example just now, with 90 texels per unit that took 1 hour to bake, I increased the indirect samples to 5,000. That cleaned up a lot of the noise, but the baking time shot up to 5 hours. And I tried to increase the indirect samples to 11,000. Again, the machine gave up. But I did it with the GPU progressive Lightmapper, and I got it done in 45 minutes. And because I have a much higher indirect samples, I get a much higher quality Lightmap. This is another shot with the same settings on the GPU progressive Lightmapper. So you can see the Lightmap is a lot cleaner. So here are some tips. If you're doing Lightmap baking or lighting in Unity, you can exclude small objects from your Lightmap baking. For example, like let's say I have this very small bottle placed on a table. So these small bottles also deflect lights, right? You have light hitting the bottle, and the bounce light will hit the table, and it will affect the general. You might have color bleeding. But because the area that is affected by this small bottle is so small that you can actually neglect it. So if you remove all these small items, you can increase your you can reduce your bake time. Excuse me. And for bigger objects, sometimes it is very difficult or impossible to remove UV seams. So you see on the left here, I have this bed with seams, and as a result, you see artifacts. On the right there, I use a light probe proxy volume instead. So it is not statically baked, but using a light probe proxy volume. Here's a larger image. So I couldn't get rid of the UV seams, so it's just impossible. So then using a light probe proxy volume, I got a better result. So next, if you're baking light, you can adjust the light's shadow angle to create a more diffuse light. So the default value is 0, and that's what you get. If you increase that to 2, you get that. So if you compare like the floor here, the edges of that light is softer. This is a larger image to compare, 0 and 2. And I increase that to 4, and this is what you get. Increase that even further to 8, this is what you get. I increase that to 20, this is what you get. and you can notice with higher values, is more diffuse, but you also get more noise. And I do this so that you don't have to. Cool. Next, you can actually assign a Lightmap parameter just for an object. So let's say your entire scene, you set it to 2 texels per unit, and you're not capturing the detail that you want. Instead of increasing that, you could actually use a separate Lightmap parameter and assign it just to that object that is not capturing the detail. So then you're not necessarily increasing the baking time for the entire scene, but just for that object. So it's a lot more efficient. And we've introduced custom fall-off for the progressive Lightmapper. So the default behavior is using a linear fall-off, which is not very accurate, but you can use a custom one, for example, maybe an inverse square fall-off, which will result in a much realistic lighting. You can read more about it in this link here in the manual. And you should use the processing stack, because for one, if you're working in high dynamic range, you would need tone mapping, and post-processing stack allows you to do tone mapping. So for example, if we're now in this room, or rather in this room, you see everything exposed okay, but then if you look out the window, it's overexposed. Or if you look out the window, is well exposed, but then the room is now darker, is underexposed. That's because the monitor is not able to display a wider range than what our eyes is capable of perceiving. And you need to do tone mapping to match it or to remap it to a range that is able to be displayed by a monitor. So here are some resources if you want to find out more. So the first link is very good. I encourage you to read it. It gives you a very, very nice breakdown of the lighting pipeline and how you should choose a pipeline for your project. Second one is even better. It gives you a breakdown of the real-time GI. How do you make sense of all the different parameters? How do you optimize it? And how do you reduce your bake time? And the last two links will explain lightweight render pipeline and HD render pipeline. So thank you. I hope that was useful, and I'm running out of time. So if you have questions, I'll be around. Feel free to come up to me. Otherwise, this is my email. If you want to shoot me an email, that's fine too. Thank you.